Alright Igor, so don't forget we're using our new camera system today. You're in charge of everything. We've gone through it all. You know how this all works. You've got it covered.
I'm on it.
Excellent. I knew I could count on you. You're my go-to guy. So remember how this works. When the countdown timer gets to 0, that's when you switch to camera 1. That's where I am. And okay, we're ready to go. 3, 2, 1. Alright, Igor, camera 1. Igor, camera 1. Igor? What are you doing? Quit playing around. Switch to camera 1. We're live. Thank you. Oh, no, not camera 2. It's the turn. Oh. Igor, camera 1. I'm on camera 1. We've been through this. I don't know how many times we really need to... Hey, hi everyone. Welcome to the show, the Bandlab, with your host, me, the professor, and my assistant, Igor. Igor, where are you? Oh, here he is. Alright, yeah, my assistant, Igor, the camera operator. Okay, so as promised last episode, we're going to be focusing on MIDI this episode, and in particular, creating drum beats with MIDI. Before we get to that, a quick definition of what MIDI is. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, which doesn't really tell us anything. Essentially what it means, well, by musical instruments we're referring to electronic instruments, obviously, because acoustic instruments don't have digital interfaces. So electronic instruments are capable of talking to each other, or different components that are involved in making music can talk to each other, whether it's software like our DAW, or a keyboard controller like I have over here, various things. In fact, here I'll show you a diagram. So in this diagram what we have is a MIDI controller, which as I said, something like this, which has a piano style keyboard, possibly pads, maybe only one or the other, it may not have both, and various knobs and buttons and sliders and stuff that you can use to control various aspects of the hardware, software it's connected to. So we have our MIDI controller, and typically that would connect to a computer, and this computer will be running some sort of software, for instance Bandlab in our case, and this software will have some sort of sequencing capability, which means it'll allow us to record MIDI, playback MIDI, edit in various ways. So Bandlab has a sequencer built in, we're going to be working with that. In addition to the sequencer, there are various pieces of hardware that a MIDI controller can work with. So you'll see on the diagram here, we have, say at the bottom, the MIDI controlled multi-effects. Multi-effects, well, this can be a floor pedal board of some sort that can be controlled via MIDI, or it can be rack mounted effects, any kind. But anything that could be synced to music in some way can be controlled from a music track, or a MIDI track synced to this music. We're not going to be working with that today, although Bandlab does have various effects built into the DAW that we can control with a MIDI controller if we want, and we'll get to that in another episode. We're not going to be dealing too much with the effects aspect of it, so we can ignore that. If we look up on top, you'll see MIDI lighting / fog machine controller. There's another way MIDI can be used to control, again, something synchronized to the music, whether it's lights, special effects of some sort, pyrotechnics, you name it. Again, we're not really going to be doing any kind of live performance here. We're just going to be working with software, so we don't really care about that. That leaves a MIDI tabletop synthesizer. Electronic musical instrument basically has two components. Our controller, which the performer uses to manipulate, to produce the notes, or to tell our synthesizer what to play. The synthesizer can be a hardware one, and here it says tabletop. It doesn't have to be tabletop. It could be rack mounted. It could be sitting on the floor. It doesn't matter where it sits. It's a piece of hardware that produces sound. We're not going to be using that. We're going to be using Bandlab's built-in virtual instruments, which are implemented in software. So we don't really need a synthesizer either. We already have one. So that leaves our controller and a computer. Controller is optional too. When we're working with the sequencer, which is what we're going to be doing, you can enter notes using a mouse or keyboard, so we can get by without the controller since we're not actually going to be performing any music this episode. Although in an upcoming episode where we'll continue talking about MIDI, we will use the controller. But for now, we can dispense with that too. All we really need is a mouse. Something like this. Alright, so I think that covers the basics. We may as well just jump right into the Bandlab mix editor now and get to work. Alright, so we're in the Bandlab mix editor. We've got our 12-bar blues and E up here. I deleted some of the stuff from the last episode that we don't need just to get rid of some clutter. So what we're left with is the acoustic guitar track and a drum track created using Bandlab's audio loops. Recall, this is how it sounds. Now, last episode, we had tried to use the drum machine to add a beat to this. I'm just going to run through this quickly because you can always review the last episode to see how we did this. And so I'm just going to go in here, choose a blues kit, create a basic beat. There we go. I'm just going to delete these patterns that were put there by default. And put mine in. So there we go. I'm going to mute the original drum track. So there's our drum beat, and it works well enough. But if you recall, the problem with this is that our shuffle rhythm has a triplet feel, and our drum machine is limited to this 4-beat and 4 subdivisions per beat grid. So we can't play triplets using the drum machine. So how do we overcome this limitation? Well, we do that by working with MIDI. As it turns out, the drum machine is really using MIDI behind the scenes. It just hides the details from us. So what we can do is right-click on the track here, export track as MIDI, and this will export the actual MIDI that the drum machine created. And now we can just drag it back into our project, and we'll see that we have a MIDI representation of this drum pattern that the drum machine created. Now if we solo that, or, well, let's just mute this. This is the drum beat. It's the same drum beat, but it sounds very different. Why is that? Well, if we look here at the instrument, you'll see that the instrument chosen, it's not a drum machine, and it's not drums, it's a piano keyboard, which doesn't really make much sense. It says here, general MIDI percussion. Why does it look like drum or a keyboard? And if we go to the editor, you'll see a keyboard here, along with all these little squares. The squares are the actual beats, and if we zoom out here a little bit, these are the beats, and you'll see this is the snare, kick drum, and the hi-hat up on top. And if we click here, I have the track muted right now, or do I? No, I don't. Alright, so if we click here, we'll hear the actual instruments themselves. This little headphone icon will turn monitoring on or off. When we're editing MIDI, every time you click somewhere, you'll typically hear the note that you're adding or editing, which can get kind of annoying at times. So you have the option to turn that off. Basically mutes the sound. And that's what was happening before. And yeah, if we look at this, you'll see that it's playing. So why is this? The general MIDI synthesizer included with Bandlab, in fact all general MIDI synthesizers, basically emulate a wide range of instruments, including percussion instruments. The percussion instruments are implemented as different notes within a particular percussion channel. So by playing different notes, you can get different types of drums. The actual notes themselves, obviously it isn't obvious looking at a piano keyboard what percussion instrument a particular note is, But there's a chart or documentation that shows you all this, and here it is. And I know it's impossible to read, and you probably don't want to read it anyway. Nobody likes to read documentation. You don't have to go looking up or want to go looking up what all these notes represent. So, what do? Well, what we do is get rid of the general MIDI percussion. We don't have to use the general MIDI synthesizer. We can actually use the drum machine's drums with our MIDI track. So we're going to come back here, drum kits, and we're going to choose the same blues kit that we used with the drum machine. And you see now our representation from a keyboard becomes an actual drum kit. And if we look at the MIDI editor now, you'll see something that kind of resembles the drum machine. We have our drums here, and again, we can hear them, and they look like drums, and here are our actual beats. So now we're ready to rock and roll, except we're playing blues. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of features here that we're going to kind of skip over because they're not really pertinent to creating beats. But there are some that we're going to need to know. So let's start at the beginning here. The select tool, the arrow, lets us select one or more notes. Just like with audio tracks, we can select notes by clicking and holding the shift key to select multiple notes. You'll see when the notes are selected, they have a slight outline around them, which makes the note look smaller. That's the only visual indication that a note's selected, unfortunately. So it's a little bit difficult sometimes to see if a note's selected or not. You have to pay close attention. So we use the select tool, and once we've selected a note, we can drag it around. We can delete it by double clicking on it. Control Z, undo, or we can add a new note by double clicking there. So there you go. You'll see these arrows. These are used to lengthen a note, either the start time of a note or the end time of a note. This isn't really pertinent to drums because drums, being percussion instruments, have no sustain. So the length of the note really doesn't affect the sound of the drum at all. It's more visual preference. If you prefer bigger notes, you can have bigger notes. Smaller notes, you can have smaller ones. It doesn't really matter. Now, if we choose the pencil tool here instead, it works in somewhat similar way to the select tool. We can add notes, but we only have to click once. We don't have to double click. And just like with the select tool, we can change the length of a note. We can move them around. And one of the reasons why you might want to have bigger notes is it is easier to grab them and move them without having to zoom out significantly. So I am just going to select these, and we can select them all by dragging around them. Oops, I missed one. Now anyway, one more thing here is velocity. What do we mean by velocity? Well, keyboard controllers have typically velocity sensitive keyboards, which means they can detect how hard you hit the key. More often than not, higher velocity means louder volume. So you can just think of velocity as being synonymous with volume. More often than not, it is. So we can change the volume of individual beats. If we select one, you'll see the velocity here indicates the current velocity of the selected note. When we create notes with a drum machine and export them, all the notes will have the same velocity. I mentioned this in the previous episode, that the drum machine, all the beats are the same volume. That's one of the things that makes it sound a little machine-like. And you'll see that volume happens to be 101. All of these have a volume of 101. We can change that. We can change individual ones. If we select the V here, put the mouse over it, we can drag up or down, and you see the velocity changes. Or we can just come over here and drag the slider to do the same thing. We can select more than one note and change the velocity of multiple notes at once. For instance, if I want all the snares to be slightly lower in volume, I can select them all. And you'll notice when the velocity decreases, the note gets paler. And you'll also notice I can't go higher than the original velocity when I have multiple notes selected, only down. Alright, I just turned off that. Okay, so our problem was with the eighth notes here. What are we going to do with the eighth notes? What we're going to do is quantize them. So what do we mean by quantize? Basically, quantizing means lining stuff up to the grid, despite the fancy sounding term. You're probably wondering now, why do we need to line stuff up to the grid when we already have snap to grid turned on and everything is already lined up to the grid? There's a couple of reasons. One, we may have forgotten to turn snap to grid on and some of our notes aren't exactly where they need to be, and rather than moving them manually, we can select them and use the quantize tool to move them to where they belong. Another reason we might want to use it is because we recorded a performance using a MIDI controller and it was a little bit sloppy and we need to nudge some of the notes into their proper places. So again, we can use quantize there, and we'll demonstrate that in an upcoming episode. But for the reason we're going to use it here is because quantize gives us a few options that snap to grid doesn't. Specifically, if we look at the quantize values, you'll see a few that have T's after them. The T stands for triplet. So what that means is we can quantize to triplet values, not just eighth notes or 16th notes, which is exactly what we want with a shuffle rhythm. So we're going to quantize our hi-hat hits. I can just drag over them all like this, select them all. But what if we had a huge, big chunk of MIDI and we didn't want to go dragging across 4 minutes worth of hi-hat hits? Well, we can select just one, any one, doesn't really matter. Right-click on it, select notes with the same pitch. If you remember from the general MIDI view, the percussion track, where we had the piano keyboard, all of the percussion instruments of a particular kind are associated with a single note. So if we select all the notes with the same pitch, we're essentially selecting a single instrument, and in this case, a hi-hat. So I'm going to come here and choose eighth note triplets, hit quantize, and now you'll see our hi-hat hits have moved. Okay, so I've got a little bit messy stuff going on, so I'm going to mute this, I'm going to mute this. And you'll see now the beat works. We can loop this out as many times as we want. And in fact, if I unmute the original drums here and we play them both together, they sound almost exactly the same. So that's how we do a shuffle rhythm using MIDI. Now obviously this is just one aspect of MIDI, a very simple one. Now we've looped all this out. Now if I make any changes anywhere, you see the gray sections or the looped sections, and we can bring this back if we want. But if I make any changes to the green notes here, the gray notes will follow because they're duplicates of the original. So if I added a note here, you'll see it gets added everywhere. Now obviously we can embellish this all we want. We can play with the velocities again if we want certain beats to be louder than other beats. Like say for instance the hi-hat, maybe we want the hi-hat hits that fall on the beat to be a little bit louder than the hits that fall between beats. Little things like this can add a lot to make a track sound a little bit more human. Now you've probably noticed there's a Humanize button here, grayed out. What does that do? Well, if we select, let me just zoom out here a bit. Now if we select all these notes and click on Humanize, watch what happens. You'll see they moved slightly. What Humanize does is it randomly moves notes slightly off the grid, ahead or behind. So notes don't fall exactly on the beat. And again, this kind of emulates a human who isn't perfect. They're going to be slightly ahead or behind at different times. Not significantly, it's not enough to make you sound sloppy. Just a little less machine-like. There are a few other options here. For instance, random. Random kind of does for velocity what Humanize does for the rhythm, in that it adjusted by a random value. The trouble with random velocity is that it's a little too random. It'll change the velocity by a significant amount, anywhere between 64 and 127. 127 is the maximum velocity MIDI provides for, and 1 is the minimum. Well, 0 is the minimum, but technically 0 means no volume at all. So 1 would be the minimum audible velocity, and 127 the loudest. So we can, when we change the velocity, we generally want it to stay fairly consistent. We don't want too much fluctuation. But again, it really depends on the situation. Some beats you may want very soft, some you may want very loud. But there's generally some purpose behind when you play loud and when you play soft. It's not random. So the random may not be the best option, but it is one that's available. A few other things here. Legato has no effect on drums. We're not even going to touch that. These other options here that are grayed out, the -1 + 1, -12 + 12, let you shift the pitch of a note, which again doesn't really make sense with drums, because shifting the pitch of a drum will actually change the drum that's being played. You probably don't want that. So that covers all the basics. Now, of course, we can create multiple patterns, just like we did with the drum machine. I can right click here and create region. Now I've got a new MIDI region created. I can edit this independently of the other one, combine them any ways I want, chop them up, treat it just like we can audio regions, and rearrange them any way we like. And again, we can save these as MIDI files if we want to use them later on in another project. Okay, so that is basically how we edit a MIDI track that was created using the drum machine. What if we wanted to create one from scratch? I'm just going to delete this one, and now we're going to create one from scratch. So we're just going to come here, add track, instruments. Instruments represents Bandlab's virtual instruments, which includes the drum machine. So now we've got an instrument track, and if we come here, it defaults to grand piano, and MIDI editor shows a piano keyboard, which is not what we want, but we know how to fix that. We're just going to come into here, drums, choose our blues drum kit. There we have it, just like before. Now if we go into our MIDI editor, we have our MIDI editor. I'm just going to grab the pencil tool, and I'm going to do basically what I did with the drum machine. Okay, so here are our beats, and if I play this, okay, so we have the same beat that we had before. You'll notice the notes came out bigger this time, which is fine. As I said, the size doesn't matter. The notes will default, just so you know. I have my grid size set to 1/16. Whatever your grid size is how the duration of the notes will be when you initially start. So these are all 16th notes. If I change the size of a note, let me just stick one here, I'll make it longer, and then add new notes, they're going to be the same length as the last note. And again, we can always change the length of notes, but for drums we don't really care, so we'll keep it at 8th notes. Another interesting little bit, which I didn't mention before, when we have velocity selected, and this will be more obvious when we have larger notes here, you'll see a black bar at the bottom of each note, and that bar represents the velocity of that note. If I bring the velocity down, the bar gets shorter, and as before, it gets paler, and we can move it up or down any way we want. So I'm just going to basically put it back to where it was, more or less. Doesn't have to be exact, we don't care. All right, so there's our velocity. Now, one of the things you'll notice, let me put this actually back to where it was. When we exported the MIDI track from the drum machine, all the notes had a velocity of 101. When we enter notes using the mouse, the notes will always have a velocity of 127, maximum velocity. which we probably do not want. I know I don't. No drummer and no musician at all, regardless of whether we're doing drums or any other instrument, is always going to be playing as loud as they can. If you want dynamics in your playing, you're generally going to be playing moderately loud and leave room for yourself to play louder if needed or softer. So when I create a track like this, I like to go and adjust the MIDI velocities to a reasonable level, or what I find reasonable. So I select all the notes and I'll bring them down to about 100. 101 doesn't really matter exactly. Again, this gives me some headroom. I can make some notes louder if I want, and of course all the notes can be made softer if necessary. So it still sounds the same, just not quite as loud. And just like before, we can loop this, we can do variations of it. We can add fills. You know, if I want to start with a crash instead of and okay, that was long because I made the last note long. I'll make it shorter. So there we go. We can do something like that. Not going to get into this too much though, because we're starting to run out of time. I don't want this episode to run too long. So this covers the basics of MIDI. Again, I should point out that the snap to grid is going to have an effect on where these notes fall. So right now I'm set to 16th notes, so I can put 16th notes in here, but I can go as low as 32nd notes. We couldn't do that with the drum machine. We were limited to 16th notes. So I can get really right, and I'm going to make that small because 32nd notes are small. So you see, we can really get in there and play a lot of notes in a very small space. But I'm not going to do that. I'll let you guys do that. And I think that pretty much covers everything we need to cover right now. So I think we should get back to the main screen. Alright, so that was our episode. We discussed MIDI and how to create beats using MIDI. So you can see it's not that difficult. It's very similar using the drum machine, other than the fact that we have a lot more flexibility and more options available to us as far as creating more complex beats. So next episode, we're going to go into MIDI in more depth, look at some of the other virtual instruments available, and I don't know, actually create some music maybe. Probably learn how to use a controller along with it, and who knows what else. So don't forget, like, subscribe, and if you have any kind of comments, suggestions, tips, criticisms, you name it, leave them in the comments section. I check the comments and I reply to them. So until next episode, from Igor and myself, take care. Okay, good work, Igor. Look, I gotta get out of this lab coat and covered in bird poop. Can you take care of the closing credits and stuff? I know you're more than capable.
Okie dokie.
Alright, great. Thanks a lot. I think I'm just gonna unwind a bit, play some keyboards, alright? Okay. Igor!
Oops.